Thank you for joining us today. It's really great to see so many people here for this session. My name is Rehanna Chowdhury. I am a member of the Cladding Safety Scheme working in Homes England. Really happy to welcome you to this autumn learning programme. And it's a series of knowledge sharing sessions on topics that you've told us that you're interested in. So hope you get a lot out of this as well. So today's event is around the new building safety regime and also an introduction to the Cladding Safety Scheme, which is a scheme aimed to help buildings remediate unsafe cladding. And while these sessions are designed for local government, we're obviously really welcoming everybody from this sort of sector who's interested in this topic as well. So the autumn learning programme, as you may already know if you've attended previous sessions, it's brought to you by Homes England's Local Government Capacity Centre. The slide that you can see now summarises who they are. And the learning programme is just one of the tools offered by the Local Government Capacity Centre. Offers also include Housing Information Hub, a capacity analysis tool which you can use to assess capacity. And we look forward to hearing how we did in the survey poll at the end of the session as well. Slide, please. So on the screen, you will see a breakdown of the agenda for the session today. We will obviously kick off with welcome introductions, which we're doing now. At 10:35, we will then pass over to Tom, who will go through the Building Safety Act, Part 2, and the building regulations. And then we will hand over to, and then Tom will hand over to Helen, who's the director of the Cladding Safety Scheme, to go through the Golden Thread and the Cladding Safety Scheme. We'll then have a section for Q&A, which we'll kind of pull out of the questions that you've put in the chat. And then we have a final remarks at 11:55, aiming to close by 12. So I think that's pretty much it. So I am going to pass over to Tom now to introduce himself and to do the first session of the session. So thanks very much, Tom.
Good morning, I think everybody. Thank you very much for the introduction, Rihanna. I've been invited to talk on this call. I'm an associate technical director with Arcadis in our design and construction safety team, covering off the topic of the Building Safety Act and amendments to Part 2 of the building regulations. So on the next slides, I'm going to be covering off a few topics to hopefully kind of increase your understanding in each area. First of all, kind of running through these three items I've just mentioned, ending with high risk buildings as well, which is kind of a key differentiator with the regulations and something that everybody kind of needs to be mindful of. So moving through to the next slide, the Building Safety Act. So the slide following this shows some examples of why we need kind of change. And if we can move on to the next slide, we can certainly see several examples that I think probably a lot of people are aware of kind of unsafe kind of practices within schools, tower blocks, modular schools, etc., that have kind of had insufficient kind of oversight when they've been kind of constructed and designed. Local to me, because I'm based in Cambridge, obviously there was a recent kind of article around kind of foundations of a kind of housing development. So we've got an awful lot of examples where there has been a lack of rigour throughout all phases of the construction industry, and really kind of has shown kind of the need for change. On the next slide is perhaps kind of the real kind of catalyst for change, which is the unfortunate events of Grenfell. There really needs to be a complete overhaul of building safety, driven by this unacceptable loss of life, which was this tragedy. The aim was to kind of move and transit to a really holistic, full life cycle approach to maintain and create safe buildings. The last point in the top sentence is really kind of key in terms of the clear message that everyone throughout in the construction industry needs to take ownership and play their part to keep kind of buildings safe. The kind of review into it, kind of did note that there was kind of the four titles on the right in terms of kind of ignorance and indifference around kind of regulations, guidance, and the kind of focus to try and do things quickly and cheaply, in terms of kind of putting in value engineering, etc., kind of which is really kind of at the behest of kind of the detriment to kind of the safety. And also the last point about enforcement was not often pursued, linking back to kind of indifference and lack of clarity around who was doing what as part of any kind of construction project. On the next slide, this obviously led to the introduction of the Building Safety Act. There were a lot of kind of key changes that were covered, kind of listed on the right-hand side. Obviously, there was kind of the focus on fire, but that then led through and follow through to kind of building control, and the amendment of building regulations. A new building control authority was introduced, as well as this new classification category of high risk buildings, which was subject to a much more stringent regulatory regime, needing kind of gateway approvals, and golden thread, which is going to be covered off kind of by kind of Helen later on as well. It really was just to introduce much more regulation and rigor around construction projects, but also bring in protections for leaseholders, as well as tougher penalties for when things aren't done as they should be. The next slide really kind of shows where the Building Safety Act sits. A lot of people kind of think that it is kind of links to the CDM regulations, but this slide graphic just shows that it is completely separate from it. It is much more linked to the Building Act, building regulations, fire regulations, etc., and is entirely separate to the Health and Safety and Work Act, which is where gave kind of the kind of early stages from the developed later into the construction design and management regulations in 2015. So on the next slide, guess really just shows the huge raft of legislation that came out associated with the Building Safety Act, both primary and secondary, showing how everything is interlinked, which is the whole kind of aim of it really. But the bottom kind of left showing the vast majority of new regulations and provisions kind of came out relating to the new category of high risk buildings. But this just shows the breadth of legislation and regulation that you need to go through in order to get a really detailed understanding of the implications of the Building Safety Act on any kind of construction projects. Trying to bring it a bit closer to this audience on the next slide is kind of a couple of kind of the key comments really is competency. One of the outcomes of the David Youth Hackett's review and into the Grenfell kind of tragedy was around competence, and there is a huge focus on competence and requiring kind of proper evidence of skills, knowledge and experience to fulfill your role as part of the changes that have been made under the Building Safety Act and amendment to the building regulations. It's really kind of a focus, and as with everything else, really, you've got to have the right people with the right skills and knowledge on your project, kind of for it to kind of operate safely. And that goes through from the principal designer role that's been introduced under the building regulations and also the principal contractor. In addition to that, there's a note about high risk buildings at the back end, where there's kind of covering off kind of past kind of historical sanctions, and also kind of need for a mandatory occurrence reporting scheme and system. So moving on from the Building Safety Act into kind of changes to the building regulations under Part 2A. So the next slide shows have been introduced to really bring in new duty holder roles as part of the amendment to the building regulations. It was really to drive greater accountability for the actual design of the building. So there were new legal duties introduced for clients, designers, contractors, principal designers and principal contractors, which to anybody familiar with construction sounds very, very similar to those roles set out in the construction design and management regulations as well. The next slide, I guess, kind of summarizes the client requirements, which is where quite a lot of you may sit. So a client, in terms of the definition, is very similar to CDM again. It's making those suitable arrangements to ensure compliance with requirements. That looks about kind of cooperation with people, providing appropriate building information, as well as putting appropriate arrangements in place for higher risk kind of buildings work, in terms of reviewing your buildings. The competence piece comes in again, but again kind of falls through kind of the governance side of things, in terms of having correct appointments in place in writing, and then it really is kind of taking the focus on, as clients, taking all reasonable steps to check competence of anybody you're asking to fulfill any of these legal roles. The next slide, I guess, covers the applicability of the amendments to Part 2A of the building regulations. Basically, it's anything that requires building control kind of involvement, and links back to the definition of building work under the building regulations. This hasn't changed, and therefore this is what catches a fair few people out, because there is the talk about the higher risk buildings. People think that that's the only element where this actually kind of applies, but it does link and back to the building regulations, and so far has got quite wide-reaching kind of applicability. On the next slide, it's really kind of looking at the new principal designer and principal contractor roles. This is the amendment, and they were new roles inserted into the building regulations themselves through the amendments. The definition of them is linked to the CDM regulations in terms of the number of contractors on site. So if you've got more than one, or it's foreseeable that you have kind of more than one, then there needs to be a principal designer and a principal contractor appointed to the project. The next slide really kind of covers all of the approved documents and shows the vast number of building regulations that need to be considered as part of any project. Looking at through all of these, you can see it covers absolutely everything, and I'm sure people are kind of familiar with kind of the range of building regulations, but it's the additional aspect that the principal designer building regulations needs to review and check compliance of all of these from the design team, and ask for evidence that they have kind of complied with those as well. The main change to the building control process, if we can jump back to the previous slide, thank you, for non-HRB projects, is the need to kind of have declarations related to the project, which are signed by the client, principal contractor, and the principal designer. Basically, it's a compliance declaration. So it is signing off that those three parties have fulfilled their duties under Part 2A of the building regulations, and that everything that has been designed, constructed, and implemented is compliant and complies with the building regulations. It's slightly different, as noted on the next slide, for higher risk buildings. And if we can move to the next slide, we'll see that there are three gateways. Now, this is coming from the building safety regulator, who takes over from building control authority for all high risk building work. And these gateways are almost, they're mandatory, and obviously you cannot progress to the next gateway without approval of the latter. And indeed, in terms of gateway 3, it's prior to the building can be occupied as well. So you've got to have an eye on all the information that goes in and forms part of these gateway submissions throughout the life cycle of the project. And I think Helen's probably going to touch on that later in terms of the golden thread aspect. So having kind of touched on high risk buildings, I just thought I'd go into a little bit more information on them. So if we can jump forward a couple of slides, I think just looking there's an entirely new framework that's been brought in. So as mentioned previously, the building safety regulator which is kind of linked through to the HSE, or past the HSE, and the Building Control Authority for higher risk buildings. So they're now a statutory consultee on the planning applications, and as I've said previously, there are decision points that they have during design and construction, which there needs to be approval for before works can commence, before occupation, and that type of thing as well. In terms of the high risk building regime as well, it was also wanting to kind of pull out new duty holders with very clear accountability and statutory responsibilities, because that was one of the kind of the main kind of failings kind of that noted out of the Grenfell kind of inquiry, which is linked through to the golden thread of building information, which again Helen will kind of cover, and that will come, which is the information you have to capture during design construction, which is then passed on once the building is occupied at the end. And everybody's probably heard about the registration and registers kind of required of the kind of higher rise buildings, and also from a competence perspective, linking back to kind of building inspectors and building control approvers as well. On the next slide, try to kind of outline, so, well, what is a higher risk building? There is kind of definitions here, and obviously it is linked to the kind of usually the risk of kind of those that occupy it. So as you can see here, it's got an element of height in terms of kind of 18 meters in height and 7 stories, and contains at least 2 residential units. Within the regulations, there are exclusions in occupation, but may perhaps not in construction. And I've listed them here in terms of hospital, care homes, kind of secure residential institutions, hotels, and military barracks. They are excluded from the high risk regime, regardless of how many residential units they contain. It's because they usually have specific other legislation associated with them when they are kind of treated as construction projects. On the next slide, I tried to kind of expand on that and just showing some kind of the key criteria to consider when you're determining if a building is high risk. And it's quite looking at these terms as counting stories, but there could potentially be stories that aren't included. You've got basement levels on the right hand side. You've perhaps got an underground car park, and that shows that you could have multiple towers. If they're sat on a podium, they're all kind of linked in, and the whole project should be treated as a high risk kind of building. On the next slide shows kind of another graphic where you kind of try and show exactly where to count from, where you've got kind of buildings set into kind of a slope. So you do need to consider kind of the ground level, what the rooftop use is. I think there's a current kind of scheme in progress where the building safety regulator is reviewing whether the top is a roof terrace, and whether that kind of links back, and it should be counted as a residential story. There's a link on this slide which should be found very useful, but it does kind of follow through to the government website and gives you kind of these graphics are all available there, where you can actually assess the say to the building itself. Moving on, kind of a slide, I guess I've mentioned and touched on the golden thread a couple of times. This is kind of the key information that allows everybody to understand the building and the steps needed to keep both the building and the people safe during construction, operation, and the future. So it starts its collation in kind of REBA 0 in terms of kind of setting up and as clients kind of setting up a golden thread strategy if you're dealing with a higher risk building, and moving that through the entirety of the project. There is a key kind of definition of the information that you need to provide as part of this in terms of the high risk building regime. And as can be kind of seen in this graphic here, it's really got to make sure that it's accessible to everybody. It's very visible. There's assurance there so that everything within it has been checked and kind of signed off and had that appropriate rigor around the review. But it's flexible as well. So you've got the life cycle of the building to come through and the operational side. So any projects there need to kind of feed back and flow into it. So on the next slide, I think just a couple of kind of concluding thoughts. Building regulation requirements haven't changed. Rather, there's been amendments to the building regulations and new legislation introduced to improve overall safety. The second point I would really kind of advocate assessing your estate. Most of you have probably hopefully already done it, but it's at the early stage that you do that, so that you can really understand the Building Safety Act implications, and also the applicability of Part 2A of the building regulations, such that you get the right people appointed at the right time. If you haven't one already, perhaps develop and implement a building safety policy and procedures to manage your estate and projects, which aligns the legal requirements, because as clients, this will really show that you're fulfilling your legal duties, but also you can be able to demonstrate this incredibly easily if asked. Linked back to that point, perhaps, and this is kind of one of the parts that helps with this, just having internal training to relevant roles, such as that understanding there of the legislative requirements under the Building Safety Act and Part 2A, such that somebody might kind of say, okay, I think this does apply to my project, and they go seek appropriate advice. And on this last point, it is a very technical area, so I think I would kind of loop in technical specialists early and throughout the life cycle of your projects to provide advice and make sure that the correct process is being followed, especially because we are seeing, in terms of gateway applications to the building safety regulator, it's not the quickest of process at the moment. And obviously it's everybody is still learning, but there have been kind of rejections so far of information that's been submitted. And I think on that point, probably going to pass over to Helen, just to kind of cover off on the Cladding Safety Scheme. I've seen some questions come in, so I'll pick up and answer those at the end. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Tom. That's great. Okay. Hello, everyone. I'm Helen Fisher. I'm the Director and SRO for the delivery of the Cladding Safety Scheme here in Homes England. So as Tom's kind of outlined some of the changes with the building safety regulation, and we've got some really good questions that have come in as well, I'm going to just kind of describe how we've adopted that into remediating the stock that was built over the last kind of decade or so that's got real issues, and kind of we're navigating that within the Cladding Safety Scheme currently. So if we just move on to the next slide, please. So on the next slide, I'm talking about scheme background, and I think this is important as well in like some of the kind of questions in there around kind of where the Building Safety Fund, the Cladding Safety Scheme, and the portfolio of opportunities and different schemes come together. So if we can just move on, thank you. So we always put into context why the programme is here. Grenfell was an absolute, it was a terrible tragedy, and we're now 7.5 years on from there, and we have got still a huge amount of work to do in order to make sure that leaseholders and residents are safe in their homes. There's been a huge amount of progress and effort made on what we refer to as kind of the high-rise, high-risk, and buildings very similar to the types of buildings that were like Grenfell. However, there is a whole medium tier as well that we now need to focus on, and where the Cladding Safety Scheme fits into that, I'm going to describe in a little bit more information. Okay, if we move on to the next slide, please. The Cladding Safety Scheme is one of 5 overarching programmes that has been put in place over the last 4 to 5 years. What we wanted to make sure we understood now is that the Cladding Safety Scheme is the government scheme and the grant-funded scheme for any application form outside of London, regardless of height. So if you needed assistance and grant, or even expertise, knowledge, some extra assistance and support, the Cladding Safety Scheme and the role of Homes England is absolutely primed in there for any height building. Within London, we are still responsible for all application forms via our building remediation hub, so even high-rise buildings there. But as we then do eligibility. If a building is found to be eligible, we pass that over to the Greater London Authority, who continue the Building Safety Fund for high-rise buildings, so 18-metre plus buildings. The Cladding Safety Scheme in London does operate, however, on 11 to 18-metre buildings. So it's all height new application forms outside of London, 11 to 18 within, but it's the same application form that you will fill in for the high-rise Building Safety Fund in London, and Homes England in the background will send those through to the Greater London Authority to move those application forms on. The ACM fund, which was the type of cladding that was predominantly on the building in Grenfell, is now closed and kind of working through its final application forms, of which Homes England played a role in that over the last 4 years. You've also got social housing and the developer pledge programmes that are very much monitoring programmes that the Ministry of Housing absolutely lead on. So MHCLG are monitoring those in the sector and working with those developers and the social sector to make sure that those kind of are gaining momentum and progress. If we move on to the next slide, please. Okay, next one, please. So looking at the scheme design, the introduction of the Building Safety Regulator has been pivotal to how we've now designed out the Cladding Safety Scheme, with this big question of what are you doing, what is the plan, and how are you then going to prove that that work has met the new regulation? That is a bit of a shift, as previously it's been more, have you, can you confirm you have, and that kind of being very self-reflective. The big shift in that kind of narrative is the fact that you need to prove, and you need to be able to say, I have done these types of tests. This is how I am confident we now meet the regulations, and this is the person or specialist individual who is now responsible for ensuring that those things comply. And that is a cultural shift within the sector that is needed in order to make sure that the Building Safety Regulator can sign off the fire safety assessments that come through and the fire safety application forms that they're looking at for new and the existing remediation stock as well as they move through. Next slide, please. Thank you. So we've designed the programme to, one, focus entirely on pace and to make sure that we can get decisions into the sector quickly, and to remove any form of bureaucracy of process. That's been one of the key indicators of the Cladding Safety Scheme following its predecessor programmes, of which we did an awful lot of learning from those, and the great progress that some of them have made, and also some of the learning from the users in the sector. It's incredibly data driven, so there is a volume of buildings now coming through this. We think up to 4,000 buildings still require remediation and help. Therefore, we have to take a data driven approach with that, and that feels a little bit less case worker driven, so we are not in the detail of every single application form. We cannot afford to be. Therefore, we are data driven. We are looking at the pace of which people are moving through key stages of the process and really starting to flex our understanding and interactions with different people depending on the progress being made and the effort and capability and capacity that we see within some of those teams. However, it has been made to continuously improve with the sector, and even since we launched around 15 months ago, we have now iterated around 17 new digital components into that process to make that work better in the market, better for the users internally, and increase then as a result the grip that we have over the programme as a result, and also the pace of which everybody can move through this programme, ensuring that we've got the right information at the right time to share that across a whole plethora of stakeholders and those people who need to be involved, and make sure we're sharing that information effectively across the sector. Next slide, please. Thank you. So in the scheme design, we looked at 3 distinctive processes, certainly at the front end. One was around eligibility, and making sure that there was real transparency. We heard that from the previous programmes as well, of what is the problem we're trying to solve, what do you need, what do you want, and how do you help the sector understand whether there's a problem here. MHCLG did some really great work in defining the PAS 9980. We've got fire risk appraisals of the external wall now. All of those things have matured over the past 2 years, which has been great to see in the sector. And we've had real support from the sector in maturing that and having that dialogue. That eligibility is now fairly transparent. Where it isn't, we work with the sector to make sure it's understood what the policy is, what we will pay for, what is covered, what the eligible work is. We've then put in a whole amount of support, and I think the message we always want to have within the sector is if you are unsure as to whether you fit the criteria, or you've got stock and you just don't know what capacity, capability is going to take, or you've got financial constraints, come forward and speak to the Cladding Safety Scheme so that we can at least point you in the right direction for where we want, where we can help, and if not, who can, and what those realities are within the sector of where some of this will stand. And that includes, we can provide operational support. We can give comprehensive guidance for your teams, including that around kind of the building safety regulator and those types of feedback that we get with well docked into them as a team as well. And they're being really supportive of this programme. And that is something that we're really trying to harness as progress kind of moves forward. But also funding hardship where people can't afford to have the appropriate investigations that are needed on these buildings and get to the nub of the problem so that you can fix it. They're all things that the Cladding Safety Scheme can start to interact with in the sector and really kind of help move these buildings forward at pace for those residents and leaseholders who live in the buildings and own these buildings. We have designed that digital, that is to ensure that we offer value for money and we can be flexible and move forward, and that there is a real sense of transparency of what this process is, how quickly you can move through it, and once you've achieved one part of it, what comes next, and move that flow in a fluid and quick-paced result, so that it isn't the process or obtaining the funding or help that becomes the barrier to you all remediating these buildings at pace. Next slide, please. Thank you. And to achieve that, there's quite a complex operating model that now sits in Homes England between that. And we have a national delivery model, but very much are supported locally in that space as well, via local fire and rescue service teams, via combined authorities, via local mayors, and via local authorities who are all doing different parts of this via the planning, sign-offs, permits. It is a complex ecosystem in order to kind of make this programme work. Homes England is very much in that bottom side here, where we are making sure that we've got a robust mechanism to get grant out quickly, where we can identify friction, not just in our processing, but in the market as well, barriers to capability, capacity, understanding of the new regulation and where some of that sits. And that's really a crucial part for us as we do that kind of joint delivery. Where we've got those remediation advisors as well, we've been really keen to leverage the market here. There is a lot of people who have, over the last certainly 2 to 3 years, have developed real expertise in this area. And we like to think we've really harnessed some of that. And we've got those experts who are auditing and checking and assuring and then cross-learning and making sure that we're learning and pressing that kind of best practice across the whole sector to make sure that the whole quality and culture is moving forward with us with the Cladding Safety Scheme as well. And sharing that into Homes England as well, so that we can start to see some of those best practices we're seeing on remediation start to appear on some of the new build work as well, so that culture is really starting to be built into the whole built environment and ecosystem of which we work. Next slide, please. Okay, and so we talked about the kind of golden thread of information, and data is so crucial to that cultural shift. We've designed it with the absolute intention to leverage those expertise and the skills, but understanding as well who we're exposed to on this programme has been a real conscious decision, so that where we do see some of those learnings, and we don't call them failings, but continued learnings, those people who maybe need some extra assistance in understanding what the asks are now in the market, and those who kind of getting things out to the building safety regulator with lots of feedback can require quite a lot of kind of coaching through some of this, so we can start to see how exposed we are to those and make sure that we can provide the guidance and support that will be needed in order to make sure that steps up and we start to see a marked improvement in that engagement and application form process. And we're very conscious that the building safety regulator only sits at the 18 metre plus, which is your high rise, high risk. But we've got a job to do here about that cultural shift for everything, and also the 11 to 18 being predominantly where we're seeing that volume. And we're really keen to make sure we mirror those expectations and that level and quality for everybody who has bought one of these kind of buildings and owns one of these properties, and making sure that we're really focused and making sure that is fair and transparent for the whole of the Cladding Safety Scheme. And regardless of what height and who will be the person who signs off your building control or your kind of gateway 2 or 3, we're expecting the same type of travel and cultural shift across all of that, and the same level of information, which then starts to really move through to make sure we've got a golden thread of information for every building as we move through the Cladding Safety Scheme. If we go on to the next slide, please. Thank you. We've got four key stages of the cladding safety scheme. Entice, enter, engage, and exit. Engage is by far the biggest chunk of where the work is, and you can see by the stars on the slide. That is where we obtain the majority of the information that starts to give us real assurance that we know who is responsible in this new world for the decisions and the evidence of which we require them to kind of move forward. And then as you exit the programme and say that that building has finished and has been finalised and is now practically complete, who is responsible and who's been responsible for signing those things off and making sure that they comply. And that kind of golden thread sits across the whole process as well, and requires, all of those requirements that address the fire safety risk clearly identified, and carrying them all the way through that enter process of a fire risk appraisal saying what the problem is, to what we think the works are to remediate that, and then following those works being delivered all the way through to then saying this project's been done, therefore the risk to life has been reduced, and this building is now deemed, kind of to have been remediated to a tolerable level of safety. Next slide, please. Thank you. To do that, we've built in some significant controls, which are in some ways mirrored for the 18 metres plus, and you will go through these as part of the building safety regulator, but we have put them in for the cladding safety scheme across all of our buildings. So at 11 metres plus, this doesn't change. You need a fire risk appraisal and external wall, and again, we really do welcome those parties who are struggling to obtain those, either from a capacity point of view or a cost, to come and speak to us and not let that be a barrier to the engagement with Homes England and the cladding safety scheme, because we do have a panel, and we've had a panel that's been created over the past year. It's got over 60 firms on it, and we've put together what that means for a capability and a capacity every month, and also what that means for kind of the consistency of how they work and what we have checked in order to make them move on to our panel. That doesn't mean, however, that panel is, an assured approach. It does mean that we've done a level of training with them, and that we're asking them on an annual basis to prove various levels of PI and those types of things. But we would always encourage people to make sure that there are relevant checks carried out if you appoint anyone to carry out a fire risk appraisal and external wall on your building. Those assessors also will summarise, if you use one of our panel, they have signed an obligation to summarise your fire risk appraisal in a certain way that can then help with leaseholder and resident engagement, because it's a more digestible format to say what the problem is. It also allows it to be ingested into our system and be typed into our system when you're applying for your grant, which means we get that data across all of those buildings in a consistent way that our back end can suck that data in and make that kind of usable to our data-led approach as well. We have really welcomed regular collaboration as well between the market here, between our commercial team, where we do get any issues with the audits of that fire risk appraisal work, where we do audit all of them currently. It's really engaged, and we have a good turnaround of feedback on that, where we see different approaches to proportionality, different approaches to how the 5 pillars of PAS are being utilised. We have that open dialogue, and we find the sector really engaged at the moment with that. And that's the first control around obtaining the problem, what the risk is to that building, and how we think we can fix that risk moving forward. If we move on to the next slide, please. Thank you. So the second control is then around a monthly return, and we have what is called a primary return first. And so post your grant funding agreement, you will then submit who your project team is. And this follows that golden thread of where we want to know who has worked on these buildings, so that we've got that documented and we've got that in our data-led repository. If anything happens to these buildings in the future, we can say, this is what the problem was, this is the work that we were doing on it, this is who did it, and this is also who signed off that it was compliant with regulation, and these are the things that they stated had been done in terms to make sure that those regulations had been met. One of the levels of support we will put in at these phases is called client-side support. So where we have anybody who is struggling to appoint a capable team, or a team that needs, kind of just some extra additional help, or a team where they're saying it's going to take far, far longer than we deem as acceptable, those client-side support providers work for Homes England, and we can parachute them in to really help problem solve and support the market to move those buildings forward at a greater pace. And that could be with the BSR approval, it could be with getting your designs done, it could be with a very specific planning obligation, permits, those types of things. But they're all different things that we've got scoped within our client-side support model, again, that we can help and utilise and support the market with. If we go on to the next slide, please. Great stuff. Then we come to where the full works and costs are. And this is, again, the third control. As part of the Cladding Safety Scheme, once you've put your full project team on it, you will be procuring that work package in the market. That gets submitted via a digital work package form within our system. You would have had to identify all of your key project team by then, your fire safety engineer, your quality surveyor, all of those kind of things. You will also appoint what becomes a very prevalent role in the Cladding Safety Scheme, which is a grant certifying officer. And that makes sure that we can have somebody who is checking and balancing costs as you go through this project, and you're looking at progress and the cost spent and interacting with the scheme on a monthly basis. That report is then submitted to Homes England, and we will do benchmarking and cost analysis on that full works and costs, and then we will send that for approval. And again, we've really looked at how quickly we can do some of those things now, and those we've heard from the market were really big delays previously, and we've done all we can to move that time frame in, and that should take no more than 2 weeks to get those things done and those confirmations out to the market to say, right, those costs are approved, go and sign your contracts and let's get you on site and let's move you forward with those types of things. Okay, next slide. Okay, and then the final and fourth control is around your payments. So we pay in arrears, and that is something that is fairly well known and kind of established in the market. You submit it within our system, and that grant certifying role that I've talked about also will make sure that that regular cadence of claiming and confirming that progress is being made in line with a broader project plan, and that the work that is being carried out is the work that is required on that fire risk appraisal of the external wall, and those things tally, that those works are continuing and will have an impact on that building to ensure that that risk to life is reduced in that fire safety capacity. There are notifications required in the system for major milestones, such as when that unsafe cladding is removed, any changes to the project team. So it will force you to make sure within that system that if you change those responsible, you change your system, that golden thread of information, and that project team, at which date those things change and who is now responsible for your fire safety, for example, has to be updated within that monthly programme of change. And that is the same with any costs, dates, scope to any of that project would trigger a variation, of which we will react to very quickly, because we are incredibly aware that those delays will cost your programme money, and we need to make sure we can be really flexible with those processes and incredibly efficient with how we review them and look through them. Next one, please. Thank you. So the exit assessment control is then where we're closing down post-practical completion. And again, this is very similar to how you've been past Gateway 3 within the BSR. So as I said previously, some of these controls that we've now built and embedded into the Cladding Safety Scheme are mirrored within the BSR, but because we've got a broader landscape of those that sit above and below some of those regulations, we're taking an all-height approach to make sure that there is a standardised way of working with us, and a way that gives us I suppose satisfies our need for making sure that the grant has achieved an outcome, and that we've got a level of control and confidence in what's being done here. This will check prior to the final payment being made that full project costs are signed off. It will check certification, so practical completion signed off by the grant certifying officer. It will request that building control, and we will check how those building controls have also been appointed, and making sure that there's a level of arm's length to that. Or the building safety regulator, which obviously is the new high-rise regime. We will check their certification and check that they're happy with kind of the final event. We'll also then look at the evidence all together and use our panels and our market expertise that we've put together to make sure that we're very happy with that whole chain of command, that there was a problem that has been raised, that there have been work then put together in response to that problem, and those works have been carried out to a level of quality and assurance that have been signed off by those in the market who should be doing that. Throughout that process, we also ask for various different levels of feedback and assurance, not just on the lead contractors, but also on all those subcontractors taking part in the market, so that we can start to look at some of that quality of those taking part in this and the value for money of which they kind of put forward into the market as well as they're taking part. Next slide, please. So it is trying to drive that cultural shift. This isn't going anywhere. We know that these things are incredibly important to shift that kind of perspective and make sure that we've got confidence in the built environment. We are continuing to be really collaborative with the sector, and we want to make sure that if things aren't working with how we're operating this programme, the feedback and how we can kind of iterate and move and shift is really, really important. But we would also like to be using this vehicle to kind of feed back into the sector, where we're still seeing some of the kind of the teething issues and where the sector maybe isn't getting it quite right yet. And it's crucial that we make that shift across into the market to make sure there's that long-lasting confidence and we all collectively learn from some of the failings of the past. It's really important. Next slide, please. And this kind of just shows again, we have that 4 key stage process of where the application and the fire risk appraisal comes in. There will be eligibility and auditing. So you have the input of information, and then you have Homes England sitting under that saying, okay, are these things eligible? But also we will check and have peer reviews done by other chartered surveyors, other fire risk engineers to check that those audits and those kind of assessments and investigations have been done to a level of expected kind of value and quality. Then when the works packages come in, or the associated costs, we have benchmarks built into our system, and we will check that those things have been signed off and are mirrored, and they are the absolute acceptable and appropriate ways to be remediating a building. And those things will flow through and make sure that goes all and is all kind of pulled together prior to anybody stepping on site. And that really is a big shift now to get all of that design work done up front, rather than doing that kind of traditional design and build as you go through. It's making sure that all of that is really, really clear. Then we've got the variation and change control, and again, that data flow that is absolutely expected with that, where if you change any of the work, any of the team, any of the requirements, that is captured in our system so that we can see the date of which that changed and the impact that would have had on the project. And that is then mirrored at that exit process, where we will do that final recce of the problem, the works, the costs, the sign-off, and make sure that that building has entered and exited this programme in an appropriate and effective way. Next slide, please. Okay, I'm passing back to Rihanna, I think.
Thanks, Helen, and thanks, Tom, for your presentations. That was really, really informative. We have got a bunch of questions that we're going to go through now, and they're the ones that have been submitted in the chat. We've answered some of those with some links, but I think for the purposes of this, we'll go through some of those for the benefit of everybody. I will direct them to one of the members of the team, but of course, if anyone else has anything they want to add in terms of Tom, Helen, Phil, please weigh in as well. So I'm just there was a question around the which I will just fully jump in on, that's okay, around the BSF and whether it would fund fire safety policy. So I think it's just to be clear that we are talking about the Cladding Safety Scheme here. The BSF, which is the Building Safety Fund, is closed to new applicants. So the CSS will pay for the FRU. It will pay for a project team, which should progress your project in line with the compliance that Helen and Tom have talked about today. And we also, as Helen has already mentioned, we offer technical support in the form of client-side support providers, which will help with any sort of technical gaps in an applicant's knowledge in terms of progressing a building. So I thought that would be just helpful for me to set out here before we dive into some of the other questions. So the first question that I'm going to direct at probably Helen and Tom. Is the BSR now fully resourced and have the capabilities to manage new regulations? Helen, we'll come to you first.
Yeah, I'm happy to take that first. Okay, so we know over the past 12 months there have been capacity issues within the BSR, and we use that word a lot actually at the moment across the whole sector. There's been an awful lot of dialogue in train with the building safety regulator. Like any new regime, it takes some time to stand up. We've seen a real marked improvement over that in the past 8 to 12 weeks, and we're now seeing the validation of application forms coming through far quicker. we have regular feedback into the building safety regulator, and we'd encourage, if certainly if you're in the cladding safety scheme, we ask for the dates that you intend to engage with the building safety regulator, to enable us to give them view of a pipeline, and we send that pipeline to them every month, and that is helping with resources hopefully, and helping them resource plan on what we're seeing on the remediation. But that is only part of the story. So they are very, very aware of some of those early, kind of capacity issues. We are seeing it as a marked improvement, as we kind of approach into the kind of Q4 of the year. And we met with them and exchanged emails with them over this week. And, we are seeing a real level of engagement now coming from the BSR, and a real step up into there. We know that this is important, and we're here to kind of move this forward as quickly as possible.
I'd perhaps echo that as well, and see in terms of the improvement, excuse me, but it could also be linked to improvement in submissions to them as well. So in terms of the understanding of what needs to be submitted, and the technical quality and review and rigor of all of that I touched on as well. We're all still learning a little bit about this, even though it's kind of been in place since kind of October last year, but everything is improving and getting quicker and better and safer.
Great, thanks. And I think, Helen, you already probably touched on this one a bit, but there was a question around, is the CSS working with the BSR to facilitate these new requirements? And I think you already mentioned the pipeline. But,
Yeah, so we send a pipeline of buildings to the BSR on a monthly basis, and we flag buildings that we think are extremely complex. Not all buildings are the same. And we're also working with local authorities and local teams as well, because we still require building control on 11 to 18 metre buildings, just not within the BSR. So I think we've got a machine here that is going to have a very much a local kind of requirement for those kind of mid-rise buildings, as well as then the high-rise requirements that are on the building safety regulator, and for them to sign off as well. The concept of how we treat these things culturally, we're hoping will be the same. So we're putting that same level of rigor and building in that kind of thought process of how we make sure that it's either building control or the BSR, but both are equally as important. And we need to make sure that we don't have delays on either of those things, and they're well resourced.
Brilliant, thank you. Right, so we've got another question, sort of in the sort of slightly more technical space. For HRBs, what happens for projects that do not require planning permission? So probably Tom, over to you on this, and then Phil, if you have anything you want to add as well.
I think for if it's a HRB kind of focused through the HRB regulations, that's kind of how it's kind of moved forward and gone through that regime. The whole aim is to kind of capture that, and as Helen was kind of just noting, making sure there is that rigor, process and accountability in place for the projects themselves. So Phil, I think you wanted to kind of add to that.
Yeah, just in regard, so the question was about the planning gateway one there. So yeah, if your works on your HRB does not require planning permission, then you still need to proceed to gateway 2, which is your building control submission. So it's still a mandatory gateway stop go procedure for the HRB.
Great, thanks both. So another question here in terms of the BSR. What is the recognised way from BSR perspective to prove competence has been checked by the client, PAS, etc.?
From my kind of perspective, I guess there are two kind of PASs in existence. 8671 for principal designer under building regulations, 8672 for principal contractor. But from a client perspective, it's making sure you've got evidence of those checks up front. You have done kind of the appropriate competency checks and have records and rigor around that process before you've appointed anybody. But also having kind of policies and procedures in place for your entire project. So you have that ongoing monitoring role, obviously, of them in terms of kind of asking for evidence of compliance throughout as well. So it's having the systems and procedures in place that you are kind of constantly have an eye on and kind of competency. It's also having things like internal training in place, because that shows that you're investing in increasing your understanding of your organisation themselves. So that would be kind of the key points that I'd probably cover.
Yeah, I think as well, I mean, the BSR has published quite a lot of information on it's quite a rigorous process and structure that they've put together for assessing competency. I mean, they do have competency frameworks. They do advise around third-party assessments for competency, and take quite a lot of confidence out of that. With also kind of the oversight and accreditation being recommended as part of those organisations, and using like UK accredited services to do some of that, which adds that additional layer of oversight and scrutiny on those people that you use.
Thanks all. So there's another question here around, quite technical, around measurement of buildings. So high-rise buildings classifications is 18 meters plus or 7 stories. Does the 11 to 18 or the mid-rise kind of buildings also include 5 to 6 story assets, or is it solely done on height from ground level to the floor level of the highest habitable floor? I think we've already answered this in the chat. I don't know if Phil, Tom, you want to weigh in on this, or Helen, of course, too.
Yeah, so I've just provided a link to the Cladding Safety Scheme guidance here. So it is measured on height for 11 to 18 meters, but the procedure for measuring that height is still the same procedure as you would do for HRBs as well. So that's all laid out in the guidance as well.
Straightforward. Helen, this is probably one for you in terms of your engagement and experience on CSS. How soon do you think we will hear back on building safety cases submitted? Oh, sorry, I'm mute.
So again, I think, as kind of Tom said, I think that it does depend on the quality and the kind of differing quality that you expect to see. I think what we're seeing a marked improvement on is the validation of they have it, they're in receipt of it, and they're assigning people to it. From the conversations we've even had this week with them, we know that they're still struggling with some of the quality around load bearing and proving that what you're putting on these buildings can kind of be sustained and float. So it really does depend on the quality. If you're part of the Cladding Safety Scheme, like I've said, we do have a process for you engaging on delayed submissions or ones we feel that have taken too long. The statutory is 8 weeks. We are not seeing that fulfilled yet. But there is every intention that becomes, the time frame for working through these things. Like any new regime, I think there's a mixture of, and has been a mixture of, making sure there's the right capacity, but also making sure that the application forms are of the appropriate level of quality for them to make the decisions as quickly as they would like.
Great, thank you. That is probably the wrap up of the kind of key questions that we got through. So I think that's probably pulling us into a close. I think we can share the take home message slides. So this will be included in the slides when you receive them. So there are some take-home messages, which are kind of some key things that that kind of Helen and Tom have pulled out of their projects, which is really just kind of things for you to bear in mind, and some really helpful links around kind of the Building Safety Act, the BSR. There's a link there to the Cladding Safety Scheme landing page, which has all our guidance and legal documents that we would kind of expect people to sign into as part of the program. And then just also the kind of high level kind of points around kind of ensuring a policy exists, kind of thinking ahead, and also just sort of key reminders there that CSS is really able to provide that funding support for a wide range of buildings of different heights, different sectors. And we do have the ability to provide financial and technical support to our applicants as well. So yeah, so I think that's kind of the key bits. This again will be the last slide in the pack that you are sent. So you'll have access to all of those links, and they're all links within the presentations that you've just seen. But just a big thank you to Helen and Tom for their presentations, and Phil as well, who's from Homes England technical team, for weighing in and helping to answer some of those questions. But yeah, thank you all of you for your expertise, really interesting. I hope everybody found this helpful and enlightening. And have a good Friday.